Hi, Mike.
Good afternoon, Karina.
Today we have a guest,
We certainly do.
Hans Bourghardt, rhetorical consultant.
Yeah. Hello, nice to be here.
Specializing
Very nice to
on
have
rhetorical questions when it comes, among other things, to intercultural communication. And I also know that you guys are planning things together when it comes to presentation techniques, strategic presentations, and also intercultural communications.
Indeed we are, yes.
Yes.
I think that's really interesting, especially when it comes to that kind of global world we have today. We all try to do business with countries far away, even as far as China, for instance. What do you see as the most difficult thing for a Swede when it comes to doing business with countries that we don't actually know that much about, Hans?
I think it's the first thing we should consider is looking for the common ground when it comes to culture, the way to do business ethics, traditions, and so on. Because even though there are many great differences between different cultures, for instance, comparing China to Sweden, there are also similarities in the way we go about making business, creating relationships. But you should, as a first step, I think, look for the common ground, similarities, and that's where you start, I think. In a sense, you want to create an impression that we're not that different after all. So that takes a lot of preparation, and it takes a kind of rhetorical approach, building this foundation or platform on the similarities and the things that we actually have in common, I would say.
Yeah.
I think the rhetorical approach is to look for values, traditions, because we are all humans and we have many similarities. And when it comes to argumentation, the rhetorical way of looking at argumentation, I mean, they are always value-based or based on emotions. Even arguments that on the surface looks technical or rational. And I think it's vitally important to start there.
Some people like to use the language as a tool in order to have more power over the other. I mean, if you do business with a country where you don't normally speak English and you have English as your native language, it's easier to actually be above the other part. Yeah. What do you think about that, Mike?
I would agree wholeheartedly that whenever an individual is using their own native language, it gives them an advantage. And if you look at the English-speaking world, there's no doubt about it that negotiators use that often to their advantage, particularly in a business context. I think if you look at international negotiations, often now a lot of the Europeans speak excellent English, and they cope quite well with the language. That isn't always the case in a business environment. So yes, you're right. I think the key is to, first of all, to know when that's happening and to find a way of actually dealing with it. It might not be that you can't compete on equal terms when the individual you're negotiating with is using their own language and you're not, but you have to develop strategies. Perhaps take a little bit longer when you respond. Take your time. Don't be pressurized or rushed. And it also gives you time to think about the best way to handle the position that you wish to take in general.
Is it better to have an interpreter with you?
I only if you really do suffer from a lack of knowledge, because interpreters bring with them their own problems. I mean, for one thing, it slows the process down, and quite often it can create irritation, and it's not unknown either for interpreters to make mistakes. And we know that the Chinese use interpreters a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it's more common when you have languages that are hugely different. For example, if you're looking at Mandarin as compared with English, and particularly Swedish.
What happens then? If I'm really prepared, I know the differences between the country or the people in the country that I want to do business with. What's the next step?
In preparation, you mean?
Yes.
The rhetorical way of preparation is also a preparation considering what arguments would you like to put forward and how would you like to support these arguments. And on the other side, what kind of opposition would you meet in this negotiation? Because if you're in a rhetorical sense, you are not well prepared until you actually have investigated all their best arguments against your position.
Absolutely.
And then the next step is trying to find a way to answer to these oppositions, these resentment or this hesitation or these they are hesitant in a sense, and you have to think on what grounds. If I put myself in their shoes, what would be my way of looking at it? And the only way forward, I think, is to actually put yourself in their shoes and look at your proposal from their perspective. And how would you approach them if they said, well, I'm hesitant when it comes to this because I can spot a danger here. This is weakening our anticipation of that. So the rhetorical way of doing this has to be look at the other side and come up with good answers to their opposition or their way of being hesitant or suspicious even. And then I think it's also good to have a plan B.
Oh, yes.
I mean, and perhaps even a plan C.
Okay.
And be prepared to say no at some level and actually go for the plan B. And that could be many different things. Find another supplier, another business partner or whatever. Mike talked about a disadvantage using English, not your own language, for instance.
Right.
If you actually have a plan B or perhaps even a plan C, that comes across. And that gives you some kind of strength. It might be a compensation for you not talking your first language. But I think that's a good rhetorical approach to negotiation, and especially when it comes to negotiating with people from other cultures. I think you have to have that. That's the basic rhetorical approach to it. There's another crucial thing when it comes to rhetoric, and it's the foundation of all communication and rhetoric, and not least when you're trying to persuade people. The base of everything, negotiation, is trust and credibility. Without trust and credibility, you won't achieve anything, I would actually argue.
Oh, that's true.
And I mean, the language preparation comes in the same category because, in a way, it's a compliment to your co-negotiator that you've taken the trouble to prepare effectively, and of course that includes the language and the language that you're going to need for that particular negotiation. So there is a sort of, I mean, it's a preparation which involves various different disciplines that have to be brought together, because obviously if you're negotiating in English, it's a little bit more difficult than it would be for most people if they had to do it in their own native language.
Yeah. And above all, and that is also a rhetorical way of doing things. Be a good listener.
Yes.
Let them
that's
talk.
vital.
Let them put forward their suggestions, their thoughts, their way of looking at this, their perspective, and take it in
Well, you know the old saying about salespeople that sometimes the best salesman is the salesman who says the least.
Yeah.
And by implication, does the most
listening.
listening.
A good salesman is a good rhetorician.
Yeah.
But what about the Swedish very popular consensus? I mean, where do you go from that? If you're a person that really likes to end all the discussions with consensus, well, I do agree with you, and we do have the same idea about this.
And you could actually also add compromise, because Swedes like compromise. I give you this, and you give me that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
is that a good thing to have in your luggage when you travel to do business with other countries?
Yes, I think it is, but it's not necessary. Consensus is not necessary in negotiations. It's more like, how well do I understand the other part, the ones that I negotiate with, and how well do they understand me? Because you're actually striving to understand each other really well, and you do that through communication. So in a sense, you have to be polite, diplomatic even, but you have to be honest. And honesty, as we know, builds trust in all cultures. That we have in common in all cultures, from all walks of life and wherever we come from. I mean, society is actually based on trust and credibility. And all societies are, all cultures are, but they do it in different ways.
In different ways,
so,
yes.
Do you not think that there has to be, I don't like the term, this modernism win-win situation, but I mean, when you come out of a deal or an agreement, the getting there is always a competition in one way or another. But at the end of the deal, I think it's always satisfactory if each side of the negotiation feels that they have acquired something that's really important to them.
Yes.
So that there might not need to be consensus, but there needs to be, I mean, where you have a really bad deal is when one side feels that they've been stepped on and they've come out of it badly, because then you know that agreement probably won't survive the test of time.
It's not a long-term agreement.
No. So I think that's the other. On the language side, I was going to say that one has to be systematic on the preparation side too, because when you prepare your scenarios, and I think the point you make about having alternatives is very important. And parallel to that, you need to work with some of the phrases that you're going to be using, key phrases. Make sure you can handle them effectively and competently, and draw upon them when you need them. So that there is obviously a specific language relating to negotiations.
Do you have an example?
The conditionals are used tremendously. The conditional form. Often, but not always, a conditional sentence would have if. So it would be, it's a statement of, not of certainty, but it's a statement of where you are putting a condition in front of somebody and saying, well, if we were prepared to do such and such and such, would your people be prepared to do such and such? And actually, the conditionals are quite tricky. People have difficulties with those in Sweden. So that's an area from a structural point of view. And then, I mean, there are various sort of important phrases. A very useful one is, I see what you mean. Also, the way we use, were we to do such and such, would you be prepared to? So there are all these little structures we use.
If you look at your plans now then, you plan to help businesses with these questions.
Nowadays, for instance, if we look at China, even smaller or medium-sized company, not all of them, of course, but many want to make business in China. And there's a rhetorical aspect of it, but it's also, when it comes to this project or what we are trying to achieve, I mean, we have experts that we can invite as external experts on
Absolutely.
Chinese business culture, experts on American business culture, and others. So, but what we can provide, and if I'm talking of my field of knowledge, it's the rhetorical way of thinking when you approach and trying to create business in other countries and in other cultures.
And when it comes to language then, Mike?
Coming onto the language side, and on not so much the language, but things, simple things that we've talked about on the blog before, meetings and greetings. I had a conversation with a gentleman, an Indian gentleman actually, and he said to me, and I don't think he was being critical, but he said to me that sometimes he found that Swedish people were a bit rusty on some of the standard meetings and greetings. And this is very important because, the Indians, especially educated Indians, are often more formal than the British.
And they are formal in a British traditional way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this chap actually said to me, he said, I find it frustrating that people, nobody seems to have taught people about how do you do and how do you do and that sort of thing. So I think India is quite conservative in many respects. Hans was mentioning China, and I go along with what he says, absolutely. But that's an example. So that so that's really part of the intercultural communication.
And that's really not a difficult area to go into. I mean, you need to know your basics.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and it's very important because it's a first impression. And just the other day I was at a mingling group, and I always test this. It is a formal greeting, I know, how do you do? And several people said fine thanks and how was I?
And that we know is the wrong answer.
It gets you off to a poor start, particularly in those sort of countries that I mentioned. So I think that's important.
Yes. Well, thank you. And good luck to you both.
Thank you.